In 1993, a steel plant in western Pennsylvania swallowed a man whole. Raymond Cavanaugh, a night shift laborer, walked out of the furnace bay at 4 a.m. and was never seen again. The company told his family nothing, only that his time card still hung on the wall, untouched. Police were handed reports with torn-out pages. Rumors spread of hidden accidents, suppressed by managers with lawyers on retainer. Decades later, demolition crews found fragments of a plastic badge inside a rusted beam, cataloged, sealed, and quietly locked away. His family never received the truth, only photocopies blacked out with ink. What happened inside that plant remains buried under corporate silence. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The town along the Monongahela lived by the rhythm of the mill. Shifts rolled in and out like tides, marked not by church bells, but by the clang of steel and the flare of furnace light cutting through fog. In the winter of 1993, the plant still worked through the night. Its smokestacks pushed plumes into the black sky, their glow reflecting on the river below. The sound of the furnaces was constant, a low roar that bled into the houses along the hillside. People measured their days by it. Start time, break time, end time, all bent around the mill's schedule. Raymond Cavanaugh was one of hundreds who lived by that rhythm. 34 years old, wiry and strong, he worked the night shift on furnace maintenance. His hands bore calluses thick as bark. His eyes carried permanent shadows. He had fallen into the cycle early, just like his father before him. On Sunday, January 10th, he packed a lunch, kissed his sister Linda on the cheek, and walked out into the cold evening. It was just another shift. He was supposed to be home at 4:30 a.m. By 5 a.m., his bed remained empty. By 6, the coffee in Linda's kitchen had gone cold. She called the plant. The voice on the other end told her only this: "He didn't punch out." The words sounded impossible. Raymond never left without clocking out. For a man whose life was measured by that badge, it wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. Linda drove to the mill before dawn. The fog lay heavy over the riverbank. Floodlights glared across the yard, casting long shadows of pipes and girders. She watched men leaving their shift, sliding plastic time cards through the punch clock, then hanging them back on the board. All but one slot was empty. Raymond's badge still hung there, clipped to the hook, untouched. Its plastic edges caught the light, swinging faintly in the draft from the opening door. A supervisor met her at the entrance. His tie was loose, his voice too calm. He said no accident had been reported. He insisted Ray must have walked away, though his badge remained on the board. He gestured toward the log binder lying open on his desk. Linda saw her brother's name written. The column checked out, but the signature line beneath was blank. A space where ink should have been. A gap that felt louder than words. By mid-morning, the police arrived. They spread across the property with flashlights and dogs, searching the perimeter. They found nothing. No footprints beyond the furnace bay, no discarded gear, no wallet, no trace on the roads leading out. The dogs caught a scent that drifted into the cavernous space of the furnace room, then dissolved into silence. Inside the bay, steam curled off cooling metal. The floor was slick with oil, the walls streaked black. Officers looked into the slag pits, under the catwalks, along the tanks where water hissed against hot steel. Everything smelled of heat and chemical dust. No blood, no torn clothing, no body. Only the hum of machines powering down. By nightfall, Linda returned home with nothing but her brother's lunch pail. An officer had pulled it from his locker, the contents untouched. Half a sandwich, an apple, a folded napkin. She set it on the kitchen table beside the silent phone. The clock on the wall ticked past 8 p.m. She wrote notes on a legal pad. Last seen 3:45 a.m. near Furnace Bay. Time card left on hook, no signature. She underlined that last detail until the ink nearly bled through the page. The following day, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and questions. Linda repeated the same facts again and again, each time feeling them grow less real. She stared at the corkboard above the table. where she had pinned newspaper clippings, bills, receipts. She added a new headline, "Worker missing at local mill." Beneath it, she taped a sketch of the timecard board, a crude drawing with one badge left dangling. At night, she dreamed of the mill's fluorescent lights, their hum never-ending. She saw the badge swinging in the draft, waiting for her brother's hand to claim it. She woke to silence, heart racing, certain she still smelled the acrid tang of steel dust in her room. Days passed, and with them, the official line hardened. The company insisted Ray had simply left the grounds. No evidence of foul play, they said. No sign of an accident. The log sheet was complete. Yet Linda couldn't forget the missing signature, the badge untouched, the way the supervisor's hand had hovered too long over the binder before snapping it closed. She placed the lunch pail, the sketch, and her notes into a cardboard box labeled Ray. It wasn't much of an archive, but it was all she had. She sealed it with tape and slid it under the bed, knowing she would open it again before long. When she turned out the light, the image returned. The board of badges, lined up like soldiers, all gone home but one. And in the silence of her house, she swore she still heard the echo of that fluorescent hum. The badge still dangled, untouched, under the fluorescent hum. Fog lifted slow over the Monongahela the next morning, clinging to the bridges and the mill stacks. Linda returned to the plant before sunrise, clutching her brother's lunch pail against her chest. She wanted answers. At the guard shack, she was told to wait. Minutes stretched until the guard finally waved her through. The main office sat on the second floor of an older brick wing. Posters about safety, hard hats, eye protection. Every accident is preventable, peeled at the corners in the hallway. The air smelled of stale smoke and metal dust. She was led into a room where a manager sat stiff behind a desk stacked with binders. His nameplate read Halperin. His tie was drawn tight, his expression rehearsed. Linda asked him directly, why was Ray's badge still hanging if he had left? Why was the signature blank on the log? Halperin opened a binder, flipping casually, but she noticed his fingers pause on one page. He pressed it flat with his palm, then turned it briskly and closed the cover. There was a clerical issue, he said. One of the log sheets went missing. Happens more often than you'd think. She leaned forward. Pages don't just disappear. Where is it? He adjusted his tie. We're reviewing our files. When we locate it, the authorities will be notified. His tone ended the conversation. He rose, offered a limp handshake, and guided her back to the hallway. Behind her, she thought she heard the sound of paper tearing. When the police requested the same binder that afternoon, they were shown partial records. An officer wrote a quick note. Gap between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m. Nothing more was added to the official report. Linda left the plant furious. She drove home under gray skies, rain streaking her windshield. On her kitchen table, she spread out what little she had, the lunch pail, her notes, and now a scrap of memory about a torn page. She pinned a blank index card to her corkboard and wrote one word in heavy ink, why. Days became weeks. The sheriff's office told her there was no evidence of foul play. The company insisted no accidents occurred. Neighbors came with casseroles, offering murmurs of comfort. Whispers began in town. At the grocery store, a man in coveralls stopped her near the produce aisle. Heard things get buried over there, he muttered. Logs get cleaned before inspectors see 'em. Then he wheeled his cart away. Another co-worker called late one night, his voice low. He said the cameras in the furnace bay hadn't worked in months. When Linda asked for details, the line went dead. She began keeping her own file. She labeled a manila folder Raymond, evidence. Inside, she placed the newspaper clipping, her notes, and a crude sketch of the badge board with Ray's card still hanging. She added a line in neat handwriting. Logbook page torn. Must locate. Each night she stared at the corkboard, where her sketch of the dangling badge hung beside the word why. In her mind, the scene replayed, the plastic card swinging faintly in the draft, waiting for a hand that never came. At the plant, shifts rolled on. Men clocked in, clocked out, the cycle unbroken. But for Linda, every shift was haunted by one gap, one missing page that refused to surface. A torn page curled like burnt paper in the folder. Search parties moved across the mill yard with slow determination. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving puddles that mirrored the floodlights. Police cruisers idled at the gates while volunteers spread out with flashlights and clipboards. The mill loomed like a fortress, corridors stacked with piping, stairwells twisting upward, bays echoing with drips of water off rusted beams. It was a place built to hide shadows. Frank Dwyer, a welder on the same shift, spoke to police near the furnace bay. He remembered seeing Ray shortly before the end of shift, walking with his helmet tucked under his arm. "Didn't look at me," Frank said. "Just kept heading down that corridor, toward the furnaces." That was the last confirmed sighting. Inside the furnace bay, silence weighed heavier than heat. By daylight, the space looked cavernous, a cathedral of steel. Catwalks crossed high above pits lined with slag. Cooling pipes hissed faintly, and the walls bore streaks of black soot. Officers combed the bay with methodical steps, peering under platforms and into corners where shadows clung. Near a stack of sheet metal, one officer crouched and lifted a pair of heavy gloves. They were stiff with metallic dust, edges frayed, palms darkened by residue. Each piece of gear at the plant was typically logged and assigned to a worker. These gloves matched no entry on the inventory for that night. They were bagged and labeled unregistered. The metallic powders shimmered faintly in the beam of a flashlight, clinging like ash to the leather. Linda was called to the site later that afternoon. She stood in the furnace bay, helmet borrowed from an officer, her boots echoing on the metal floor. The scale of the place dwarfed her. She saw the marked spot where the gloves had been found, but little else. The emptiness pressed against her chest. She whispered her brother's name into the space, and the echo returned hollow. That evening, she unlocked Ray's car parked outside her small house. The interior smelled of grease and stale coffee. In the trunk, under work boots and a folded jacket, she found a spiral-bound notebook. Its cover was scuffed, its pages smudged with fingerprints. She flipped through lists of shift hours, grocery reminders, phone numbers. Near the back, the final entry stopped her. 2:45 a.m., furnace. Nothing more. The ink pressed heavier than on other lines, as if written in haste or anger. She carried the notebook inside and set it on her kitchen table. The lamp overhead cast a yellow glow across the page. She traced the word with her finger. The silence of the furnace bay returned to her, the image of gloves dusted in ash. It felt less like a note and more like a marker, a timestamp pointing directly at the moment her brother was last alive. She added the notebook to her growing archive. The lunch pail, the sketch of the badge board, the clipped newspaper article. Now this. Each object carried weight, their presence filling the kitchen until it resembled a private evidence room. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Linda stared at the notebook long after midnight, the word repeating in her mind. Furnace. She imagined Ray's last walk down the corridor, helmet under his arm, shoulders hunched, vanishing into a space that swallowed heat and men alike. The word furnace bled alone on the final line. The first week bled into the second, and the company shifted its posture. What began as polite assurances hardened into controlled statements, each one read from behind an office desk. Linda returned to the plant with her growing file tucked under her arm. She was ushered into a conference room where a lawyer waited beside the plant manager. A pot of coffee steamed between them, untouched. They spoke of sympathy, of ongoing reviews, of cooperation with law enforcement. Every phrase sounded rehearsed. When Linda asked again about the missing log sheet, the lawyer cut in. "Those records are internal. Nothing relevant to your brother's disappearance has been withheld." The words were precise, stripped of warmth, but whispers traveled through the town. An older worker slipped a folded note into Linda's hand outside the diner one evening. Scrawled in pencil was a single line: "Check OSHA files." That night she sat at her kitchen table and wrote the phrase across an index card, pinning it to her board beside Ray's sketch. Within days, another fragment surfaced. A neighbor who cleaned offices part-time claimed she had seen a photocopy left in the trash, marked with the plant's letterhead. It mentioned an OSHA review and included a phrase underlined twice: "Do not release logs." The neighbor salvaged the page and slipped it to Linda in a brown envelope. The memo was grainy, the type faint, but the words were visible. Across the top, stamped in bold: "Confidential. Destroy after reading." She spread it across her table beside the notebook and lunch pail. The badge sketch loomed above them on the cork board. One by one, the objects were becoming less like keepsakes and more like evidence. When she showed the photocopy to the sheriff's office, the deputy frowned. "Chain of custody's no good," he said. "Could have come from anywhere. Without the original, it's hearsay." He returned it to her across the desk as though it were nothing more than junk mail. That night, she added the memo to her archive. She slid it into a plastic sleeve, labeling it in neat block letters: "Memo. Confidential." Then she pinned a copy beside the sketch of the badge. The board was no longer just a reminder of her brother. It was becoming a map of absence. Years later, Linda would still remember the smell of that room. Coffee growing cold, stale smoke on the lawyer's jacket, the faint chemical tang of copy paper. She would remember the precise tone of his voice as he denied withholding anything. And she would remember the way the word "destroy" leapt off the page in bold ink, a command too blunt to ignore. The memo lay under her lamp, edges curling, the black toner smudging faintly when touched. It felt less like an accident report and more like a burial instruction. In bold letters, one word: destroy. The seasons turned, and with them, the case began to fade from official view. By the end of the 1990s, the disappearance of Raymond Cavanaugh was little more than a headline clipped and yellowing in the town's archive. The sheriff's office closed the file as inactive. The mill kept running, its stacks breathing smoke over the river as though nothing had changed. But in Linda's house, time did not move the same way. She kept her brother's box of belongings close: the lunch pail, the notebook, the sketch of the badge board, the memo that warned "destroy after reading." She added to it whenever fragments surfaced: pay stubs, schedules, a copy of Ray's employee ID clipped from an old insurance form. Each piece was slipped into the folder, stacked with care and labeled with neat handwriting. One evening in 1997, while sorting through old envelopes, Linda found a safety report mailed to her brother the year before he vanished. It was routine correspondence, but one page leapt out. In bold block print, the report listed "structural hazard, furnace walkway." The line was underlined in red pen, likely by Ray himself. The page bore his handwriting in the margin: "Needs repair ASAP." The year after, when she requested the same report for 1993, she received only a packet with blank spaces where incident logs should have been. "No hazards noted," the summary read. To Linda, it was less a report than a silence. The word "hazard" stayed with her. She turned the old notebook over in her hands. The entry, 2:45 a.m., furnace blurring in her mind until it fused with the earlier warning. What had her brother seen? Had he witnessed the hazard ignored? Or had he become it? In town, stories surfaced in half-whispers. A retired inspector suggested to Linda at a church social that the company had been under pressure to avoid citations. Another man, nursing a beer at the VFW, muttered that he'd heard about a spill, a fall, something bad, the night Ray vanished. When Linda pressed, he turned away. By 1999, the case was a local ghost story. Kids dared each other to walk past the mill at night, whispering about the workers swallowed by fire. Linda collected each rumor, writing them down in a separate notebook. She did not know which were true, but she believed all pointed toward the same void. The objects in her archive began to change in meaning. They were no longer pieces of a man's daily life. The lunch pail became a reminder of a meal never eaten. The badge sketch was a symbol of a shift that never ended, and the safety report was proof of something ignored. She kept them together in a wooden chest, locking it each night as if guarding her brother's presence. On top, she placed the notebook with the furnace entry. Over the years, moisture crept in, curling the pages, blurring the ink. The word hazard began to fade. bleeding into a dark blot where meaning dissolved. Still, Linda traced the letters with her finger, memorizing the way the ink once curved. The objects spoke louder than official reports, louder than the company's denials. They formed a chorus of silence, each piece unfinished, each page incomplete. The ink dissolved into a gray, unreadable blot. By 2001, 8 years had passed, yet the silence surrounding Ray's disappearance had only thickened. Linda lived in the same small house, the same corkboard still filling with notes, clippings, and scraps of paper. She added dates in neat rows, marking anniversaries of the night he failed to come home. Each year the questions grew heavier, the answers fewer. Then one evening, the phone rang. A man's voice introduced himself as Eddie Walsh, a former maintenance worker at the mill. His words tumbled quickly, as if he had rehearsed them. "I saw him," Eddie said. "Ray was arguing with the shift supervisor near the furnace. It was maybe 20 minutes before shift end. They looked heated." Linda pressed him for more, but Eddie's voice dropped. "That's all I can say. Don't call me back." The line clicked dead. Shaken, Linda scribbled the details on an index card. Eddie W. Argument wound supervisor, 3:40 a.m. approx. She pinned it beneath Ray's sketch on the board. For the first time, there was a living voice pointing toward conflict, not just accident. She tried calling the number again the next day. Eddie answered once, but when she mentioned Ray's name, he hung up. The following attempts went unanswered. Finally, when she dialed again, the phone company announced the number had been disconnected. Around the same time, Linda received another fragment through a sympathetic clerk in the county office. She slid an incident log across the counter, whispering, "Don't say where you got this." The sheet listed a cryptic note, 2:50 a.m., unscheduled halt. No explanation, no details. Just a sudden stop in production that matched the very window Ray had disappeared. Linda copied the entry into her notebook. She stared at the time, 2:50 a.m., and remembered Ray's final words written in his own hand, 2:45 a.m., furnace. The proximity of those two notes chilled her. A man's last scrawl and a corporate log aligned within minutes of each other. At home, she opened the wooden chest and carefully tucked the photocopied log inside a sleeve. She added Eddie's number on a slip of paper, though by then it was already defunct. She labeled it in black pen, "Witness, retracted." That night, she could not sleep. She sat at the table staring at the wall of pinned scraps, the badge sketch, the torn memo, the word "Why" scrawled across a card. Now there was Eddie's shaky handwriting on a crumpled scrap, his number scratched through so heavily the paper nearly tore. When she turned out the light, she imagined her brother at 2:45 a.m., still in the furnace bay, words exchanged with a supervisor. She pictured the moment the machine stopped 10 minutes later, their roar fading to silence. In that silence, she thought she heard the echo of a man's last stand, swallowed whole by steel and secrecy. His number was scratched out with heavy black ink. By 2005, the mill was no longer the steady giant it once had been. Parts of the complex had closed, sections stood dark, but the furnace bays still belched smoke at night. Linda, older now, carried the weight of a dozen unanswered years. She filed petitions, wrote letters, begged for access to records. Most came back stamped the same way: denied. That year she tried a new route. She filed under the Freedom of Information Act, hoping to force OSHA into releasing what the company had sealed. Months passed. Finally, a thick envelope arrived. She tore it open at her kitchen table with hands that shook. Inside were documents, but nearly every page was swathed in black ink. Entire paragraphs had been redacted. What should have been incident logs were rectangles of darkness. She flipped through dozens of pages, each one obliterated. Only one fragment survived the blackout. In the middle of a page, otherwise drowned in ink, two words stood visible: Tank 14. No context, no explanation, just those letters left behind like an oversight. Linda circled them in red pen, staring at the number until her eyes blurred. She pinned the page to her board, the black rectangles swallowing light under the lamp. In the center, the unredacted words glared like a beacon: She took Ray's old notebook from the chest and on the inside cover wrote Tank 14 in bold block letters. If she could not find answers in the official record, she would make her own. At the same time, whispers stirred in town again. A man who had once worked in storage mentioned late one night that there had been an incident around the tanks. He would not say more. His eyes darted to the door as if someone were listening. Linda noted his words, but when she asked again the next week, he denied ever speaking to her. The company's public stance remained unchanged. No accident, no record, no liability. But Linda now had something tangible, a phrase that refused to vanish, a leak in the blackout. At church, after service, she shared the page with a trusted friend. The woman studied it in silence, then whispered, "Sometimes the things they miss are the ones that matter." Linda folded the paper back into her folder, heart pounding. At home that night, she looked at her wall of scraps. The badge sketch, the memo, the note from Eddie, the unscheduled halt. Now pinned at the center, the word Tank 14 glowed under the lamplight like a cipher. On the kitchen table, the folder lay open, its pages heavy with ink and silence. She traced her brother's last entry again, 2:45 a.m., furnace. Then she looked back at the phrase salvaged from blackness, tank and furnace, fire and steel. Something connected them. She felt it. She whispered the words aloud, her voice barely audible in the empty room. Tank 14. On the page, only 2 words survived. Tank 14. The demolition crew arrived on a damp morning in 2010. By then, parts of the steel plant stood abandoned, their windows shattered, their beams rusting from years of neglect. The company had contracted workers to tear down one of the oldest storage warehouses on the property. Linda heard about it from a cousin who still lived nearby. Something about the news unsettled her. She drove to the site and watched from beyond the chain-link fence as excavators clawed at brick walls. A week later, she received a call from a former worker who had been on the crew. His voice carried unease. "They found something in the beams," he said. "Didn't look right." Linda asked what. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "A piece of plastic. Looked like part of a badge. Cops came quick." Her stomach turned cold. The local paper ran a tiny article 2 days later. Demolition workers uncover potential evidence at former steel plant. No names, no details. Just a note that authorities had collected fragments of plastic and metal for review. Linda drove to the police station, but the officer at the front desk shook his head. "Ongoing matter," he said. "Nothing to release." Through a contact, she learned more. The fragment was cataloged as consistent with an employee badge, warped by heat, its edges jagged. Alongside it, a ring of keys fused together with rust. The report noted the plastic was too degraded for clear identification, but its size matched standard badges issued in 1993. Linda closed her eyes and saw Ray's badge, still dangling untouched on the board that morning. The thought that a piece of it had surfaced years later, hidden in the bones of the plant, was almost unbearable. She begged to see it. She was told no. The fragment was evidence, locked in storage. That night, she pulled out her sketch of the timecard board and pinned it beside a fresh note. Fragment recovered. Warehouse beam. She wrote the date in neat script. Her archive grew heavier, more crowded, but also more certain. The plant had not erased everything. Some traces refused to vanish. She imagined the fragment, sealed in an evidence bag, its surface warped by heat, its clip twisted. She thought of the hands that once clipped it to a hook, the moment it was supposed to mark an end of shift. On her wall, the phrase, Tank 14, stared back at her. On her table, the notebook still bore the words, 2:45 a.m., furnace. Now there was a third echo, uninvited, undeniable. A broken badge. Together they formed a chain, faint but solid, pulling her deeper into the silence the company had tried to preserve. She drove past the demolition site one last time. The warehouse was half gone, rubble piled against the fence. Rain slicked the concrete, reflecting the glow of floodlights. Somewhere in that rubble, she thought, her brother had left a trace the plant could no longer hide. A jagged fragment, edges melted, locked in evidence bag. By 2013, the story had almost disappeared from public memory. New layoffs dominated the headlines, and the plant's shrinking footprint was the talk of the town. But Linda's archive grew heavier with each passing year. What others had forgotten, she carried daily. That summer, a local journalist named Mark Ellison knocked on her door. His tie was loose, his recorder already running. He had heard of the case through whispers at the courthouse. "A man who vanished inside a mill," he said. "No records, no closure." He asked if she would speak on camera. Linda agreed, but only in her kitchen, where the corkboard stood crowded with clippings and scraps. Mark listened quietly as she pointed to each item. The sketch of the badge, the torn memo, the page with tank 14. The notebook opened at 2:45 a.m. Furnace. He nodded, scribbling notes, asking few questions. At the end, he placed a thin file on her table. "I pulled this from county records," he said. "Insurance filings. You should see this." Linda opened the folder. Inside lay a policy stamped January 12, 1993, 2 days after Ray vanished. It named the steel company as beneficiary, authorizing a payout for emergency incident coverage. The payout sum was enormous, written in full words across the page. Linda's chest tightened. She had never heard of such a claim, never received any notification. "Did your family see this?" Mark asked. She shook her head. The date glared back at her. A contract signed after her brother disappeared, acknowledging some kind of incident but leaving his name erased. She pinned a photocopy of the policy beside the notebook on her board. Above it, she wrote in marker, "Filed after disappearance." The board now told a story louder than any statement the company had issued. Mark's article ran in the local paper under the headline, "Family Questions, Insurance Filing Linked to Missing Worker." It was a short piece, buried inside, but it stirred talk in town. Old workers remembered rumors of payouts, of accidents no one could prove. One man told Mark he recalled a closed-door meeting the week after Ray vanished. Another remembered seeing executives leave late at night, carrying files under their arms. The company refused comment. Their lawyer issued a single sentence. All filings were standard and not related to any fatality. But Linda knew better. She kept the original photocopy safe in her chest, sandwiched between the OSHA fragment and the badge sketch. When she opened the lid, the papers seemed to whisper in unison. Notebook, log, badge, tank, and now, contract. Each pointed to a truth buried deeper than the furnaces themselves. At night, she sat in her kitchen, staring at the pinned documents. The date on the insurance policy glared at her like an accusation. The signature date glared, 2 days after disappearance. The years kept moving, but the questions did not. By 2015, Linda was older, her hair streaked gray, her archive spilling from one wooden chest into another. She had lived more than 2 decades with silence, yet every new scrap reignited the weight of that night in 1993. Then one morning she found a padded envelope wedged between her screen door and the frame. No return address. Inside was a plain USB stick, taped to a folded sheet of paper. On the sheet, in block letters, were 3 words, "For the record." Her hands shook as she plugged the stick into an old laptop. Folders appeared, each one labeled with dates from the early 1990s. She clicked the one marked January 1993. Inside were scanned images of memos, safety reports, and maintenance logs. Most looked routine, until she opened the file named Incident 93. The page bore the plant's letterhead. Across the middle, typed in sharp block font, "Incident fatality unreported." No name, no detail, just that phrase. Beneath it, a line of text blurred by the scan, followed by initials she didn't recognize. The metadata at the bottom of the file showed it had been created at 6:03 a.m. on the very day her brother vanished. Linda's chest tightened. The timing was exact, less than 2 hours after Ray's last scrawled note. 2:45 a.m., furnace. She printed the file, the words stark against white paper. She pinned it to the board, right beside the memo that had once commanded destroy. When she showed the printout to the sheriff's office, the deputy shook his head. "No chain of custody. Anyone could have typed this. Without originals, it won't stand." Linda slid the paper back into her folder. It was the same refrain she had heard for decades. Mark Ellison, the journalist, examined the file closely. He believed it was authentic, pointing out the format and internal codes used in the header. "Whoever sent this had access," he said. "This isn't random." But he admitted he could not publish without confirmation. That night, Linda sat before the corkboard, staring at the growing constellation of fragments. Badge sketch, notebook entry, torn memo, tank 14, insurance filing. Now this scan, stamped with a phrase that burned into her mind: fatality unreported. She taped the USB itself to the board, anchoring it beneath the printout. It hung there like a silent witness, a piece of plastic holding secrets no one else wanted to acknowledge. When the lamp flickered, the room plunged into brief darkness. In that moment, she imagined her brother's badge fragment locked in an evidence drawer, the warped plastic still smelling of heat. The board glowed again under the light, each page whispering the same truth. The plant knew. Metadata time matched the hour he vanished. By 2018, Linda's archive had grown into something that filled an entire room. Boxes stacked against the wall, corkboards crowded with photocopies, binders labeled with dates. What had begun as a sister's desperate search now resembled the office of a private investigator. Each fragment, the badge sketch, the memo, the torn log, the insurance policy, the USB scan, stood in silent accusation. That spring, the plant faced a public hearing before the state board. They needed a new license to continue operations, and families of former workers were invited to testify. Linda took a seat in the back row of the courthouse chamber, clutching her binder to her chest. Executives sat at the front, their suits pressed, their expressions neutral. When her turn came, Linda walked to the podium. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. She spoke of her brother's disappearance, of the badge left on the board, of the pages missing from logbooks. She held up the memo marked "Destroy." The insurance filing dated 2 days after Ray vanished. The scan that read "Fatality unreported." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The chairman asked the company for a response. Their lawyer rose, buttoned his jacket, and said clearly, "There are no records of a worker fatality in 1993. None." His words fell like a gavel, final and practiced. But Linda wasn't finished. She had noticed something during discovery, a slip in the company's own submission. On page 22 of the licensing documents was a roster of employees, meant to prove staffing levels. She projected the page onto the screen for the room. There, in black print, was her brother's ID number. Beside it, not the word terminated or resigned, but a phrase, "Inactive, do not disclose." Gasps filled the chamber. The lawyer shuffled papers, claiming clerical error. But Linda knew what she had seen. That phrase was not a mistake. It was a category. A file meant to be hidden, not erased. She raised her eyes to the panel and said, "If my brother isn't listed as dead, if he isn't listed as resigned, then what exactly is he?" Silence followed. The lawyer refused to answer. The executives stared at the table in front of them. After the hearing, Linda returned home and pinned a printout of the roster onto her board. She circled the words, "Do not disclose," in red. Above it hung the badge sketch, the fragment of memo, the USB scan, the notebook entry. Together they formed a wall of silence louder than any testimony. That night she sat alone in her kitchen, the house quiet around her. She stared at the board until her eyes blurred, the words floating in and out of focus. Her brother's life had been reduced to a single phrase in a hidden column, a category designed to erase him from memory. Beside his ID, 3 words, "Do not disclose." The present day carried no answers, only echoes. The steel plant, once the town's beating heart, now stood half idle, its remaining stacks puffing weak smoke into a graying sky. The storage tanks had been repainted, the furnace bays automated, and the warehouse where the badge fragment was found had long since been reduced to rubble. Yet for Linda, time had never truly moved. It circled back, always, to 1993. Her house had become an archive, a shrine built not from candles or flowers, but from paper, plastic, and ink. On one wall stretched the corkboard, crowded with artifacts, the sketch of the dangling badge, the torn memo commanding destroy, the OSHA file blacked out save for Tank 14, the insurance policy signed 2 days too late, the USB scan whispering fatality unreported, the roster stamped do not disclose, each piece pinned under light, each one proof of silence. In a wooden chest sat the objects more personal. Ray's lunch pail, still holding the half sandwich and apple that would never be eaten. His spiral notebook, its last entry frozen at 2:45 a.m., furnace. A scrap of paper with a phone number scratched out in thick ink, and the photocopied page noting an unscheduled halt at 2:50 a.m. She cataloged them carefully, labeling each in tidy script, as though one day they might be presented in court. Linda called the chest Exhibit 1. When she opened it, the smell of old paper and rust greeted her. She often wondered if this was all her brother would ever become, an exhibit in a case without a trial, evidence in a story no one would adjudicate. Each year, on the anniversary, she rose at 3:45 a.m. She lit a candle on her kitchen table and placed Ray's badge sketch beside it. At 4 a.m. sharp, the hour he should have walked out, she whispered his name. Then she sat in silence until dawn, waiting for a sound that never came. The official record remained empty. The company issued no statements. The state kept no file beyond the redacted fragments. The sheriff's office labeled the case inactive. Yet Linda's archive stood in defiance, a room full of papers speaking louder than silence. Sometimes she drove past the old plant. The fence sagged, weeds pushed through cracked pavement, and the glow of floodlights seemed tired. In her mind, she saw her brother walking once more down the corridor toward the furnace, his badge clipped to his chest, his notebook in his pocket, his shift minutes from ending. Then he dissolved into the dark heat of the mill, leaving behind only echoes. She stopped her car on the hill above town one night and looked back at the glow of the stacks. The same hum filled the air, low and endless. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light inside the empty warehouse, as if something still burned within. But when she blinked, it was gone. At home, she placed the warped fragment photo, the piece of badge the demolition crew had found, on top of the chest. It completed the circle. The badge that had once swung untouched on the board now returned as a melted shard, silent and unyielding. She knew no answers would come. But still, she kept the board intact, the chest sealed, the candle ready. Some silences could never be broken, but they could be recorded. The badge still hung, its plastic warped, no answers inside.